Welcome to Unchatted Waters. In this episode, we talk about preventing disease outbreaks to ensure we can farm seafood successfully. We learn about the fish health inspectors travelling across England and Wales, as well as laboratory testing to help uncover where disease came from and how to stop its spread. If you love a jigsaw puzzle, then this is the episode for you. Where did that corner piece go? Welcome to Unchatted Waters, the podcast that talks to the people behind the science. I'm Kirsty, your host, and I'm excited to introduce my two guests. David Verner-Jeffreys is a microbiologist who investigates emerging diseases of fish and shellfish and leads efforts to develop surveillance programs for antimicrobial resistance in aquaculture, both nationally and internationally. Chris Evans is a fish health inspector, part of a team who are responsible for safeguarding the aquatic animal health status of England and Wales. He also has a background in shellfish farming and has been working in this department for 10 years. Welcome to the podcast. Thanks for joining us.
Hi.
So I wanted to go into your biographies a little bit there because there are a few words that I'm not familiar with. And the first is for you, David, a microbiologist. Can you go into a bit of detail about what that is and what it entails, please?
Well, basically, we look at very small things, bacteria, viruses, and in this context, we're talking about healthy. So often we're talking about the nasty bugs, the bugs that can infect fish and shellfish.
Thank you so much. And so, Chris, similar question to you. What is a fish health inspector?
So, we work in a team called the Fish Health Inspectorate, which is made up of inspectors and technical and trade advisors. And our aim is principally to prevent the spread of diseases in the aquaculture industry and in the wild. These are infectious diseases that we spend a lot of our time travelling around the country, inspecting fish farms, checking records, and also carrying out disease investigations when there are reported mortalities.
So let's take a step back and talk about how do diseases affect animals in water?
Fish and shellfish are farmed like other animals, like, say, pigs and poultry. And I think everyone's aware that they get often lots of very serious diseases that can affect them. Well, fish are no different. They get same sorts of bacteria and viruses and parasites. Problem for their own welfare, but also for the farmers, because obviously they're going to lose animals to these serious diseases. Managing diseases and limiting the impact on them is critical in aquaculture, just as it is in terrestrial farming. Diseases spread quite easily in between land-reared animals, but in aquaculture you've got this perfect medium water that can allow the bacteria, viruses and parasite to transfer pretty easily between the animals, as well as by the normal contact routes as well.
So could you give me a few examples of a bacteria, a parasite and a virus?
A good example of a really important virus disease that Chris and his colleagues control is viral hemorrhagic septicemia, a long mouthful. But it's a really nasty virus and it affects farmed salmon and trout. But also it's a good example of a disease that affects wild animals as well. And in fact, at the Great Lakes in America, this disease has been devastating, spread through the lakes, really affecting them. Other diseases, parasites such as sea lice that can affect salmon are important problems, as well as lots of bacterial diseases. They have long names. Aeromonas salmonacida, which is a disease that causes a disease called furunculosis in salmon, causes these sort of lesions on the outside of the animal, a really important bacterial disease. So you have all sorts of examples of bacteria and viruses and parasites that can affect farmed and indeed wild fish and shellfish.
Furunculosis is an interesting one because it was a bacteria that was actually led to the formation of the Fish Health Inspectorate in many ways, actually back in the late 1800s. We've got a very long history of controls and disease monitoring in aquaculture and fish farming, and furunculosis was one of those first disease issues that actually brought about the formation of the Fish Health Inspectorate with someone called Frank Buckland in the late 1800s. We owe our current existence to him in many ways.
The Diseases of Fish Act, 1936, I think, wasn't it?
37.
Yeah.
So we spoke a little bit there about some of the specific diseases and some examples that Dave gave us there. But why do we need to protect our farms from disease?
First of all, for the listed diseases, they're largely untreatable. They can be absolutely devastating. Biosecurity is incredibly important. So we really want to make sure that businesses and people responsible in these areas are thinking about the risks of these diseases and they pose, They can be extremely damaging. They can cause damage to economies. It's not good for the welfare of the fish and shellfish as well. And I've had experience myself of working on an oyster farm actually, where we had a disease outbreak, and just over one tide, we lost 90% of the stock. And when this disease was introduced, and it was devastating really on the farm site. So it has a huge impact on industry, some of these diseases. I mean, we didn't think about disease and the impact it could have had until it was too late. So it's really important that as a team, the work that we do in the Fish Health Inspectorate is vitally important in raising the awareness of biosecurity. And then when there are issues, we'll place those controls so that these diseases don't cause wider damage to industry, but also importantly, protect our trading partners as well. The last thing we want for disease to spread internationally. So that's why we exist as a team.
Thank you for that really personal story. Do you think witnessing that inspired you to become a fish health inspector, would you say?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think it really did. I mean, I still remember now the fish health inspector turning up to site and taking samples and talking through the movement records, working out where things have come from and gone to. It looked like such an exciting job. I thought, well, this is great, going around the country and helping to really support industry and protect industry from these serious disease outbreaks. I mean, obviously it was a difficult time, but it definitely inspired me to do what I do now.
Amazing. What a great story. Thank you for that. So you talked a little bit there about movements and where diseases might have come from. How do these diseases spread and affect wild fish, Dave?
Sometimes fish are farmed in closed recirculation systems, but most aquaculture production takes place in cages which are connected to outside water bodies. So there's all sorts of ways that diseases can spread between the wild animals and the farmed animals and vice versa. So what we call about pathogen exchange between wild and farmed animals is an important route of disease transfer, and each can affect the other.
So I think earlier we talked a little bit about the history of fish health inspectorates and the importance of regulating diseases that come into our water systems and into our farms. So what diseases are we free from, are we protected from at the moment, Dave?
So some examples of diseases that we do not have in our farms at the moment would include a disease called VHS, which I've mentioned earlier, viral-hemorrhagic septicemia, SVC, spring viremia of carp, other important diseases. Chris talked about the economic impact of disease internationally, why we're so worried. Farm shrimp, I think probably everyone knows when you go down to a supermarket and you buy some prawns, these are typically farmed in other parts of the world, Asia and others, and South America. Incredibly important for the industry, and really maybe a good example of how having an outbreak of these diseases can be absolutely devastating to local economies. In fact, they talk about the Ecuadorian economy pretty much crashing as a consequence of the introduction of VHS into their farms. It can be really, really serious, and it's really important we keep them out. And I'll let Chris talk a little bit more the details of how we go about that.
Across the board, we've got a very high aquatic animal health status in this country, free from the vast majority of listed diseases. Something like spring viremia of carp, SVC, we do a lot of work at the borders, actually, imports of ornamental fish that could be carrying the disease. We do a lot of work at the airports with Border Force, and we sit in a little tin shed, basically, sampling goldfish and looking for this disease that could cause some real serious damage if it got into the wild, into river systems and lakes. We have picked it up previously, actually, and that just shows the importance of really the kind of border controls here. But it can be an absolutely devastating disease again. It has a very high mortality rate, but that shows the importance of good biosecurity at the borders and understanding what's happening internationally as well in different countries and their disease status.
If we take a step away from that maybe contained system of aquarium or a tank, fish don't have borders, when they're moving between different areas, and they don't align to the same, this country starts here, for example. How can we make sure that biosecurity is a global effort that we're all contributing to?
I think it's worth mentioning the World Organization for Animal Health here. 183 member countries of the World Organization for Animal Health, and they set the standards for disease surveillance, and also have a system, a sort of an online system where if a country has a disease outbreak, they notify on that using that online system, and trade partners become aware of that. So it's really important, the work. I mean, at the national level as well, it's all about our disease surveillance program, and keeping track of emerging diseases as well is incredibly important. So we have a variety of different surveillance programs, routine surveillance, targeted surveillance for those diseases that we know about, but also emerging diseases as well. And that's why there is actually an obligation on any person who has a role in handling aquatic animals to notify us if they have a high mortality or suspected disease outbreak. And again, that's really critical. It's what we call passive surveillance, because we're really relying on people reporting things when they do notice them, so we can keep on target with emerging diseases.
So you go to the sites, you take a sample, I presume. What happens to it once you've removed that? Is it a water sample or a skin sample or a visual inspection? How does that work?
That's really important. So when we're on site, we actually try and do all of our sampling on site. And it's a dissection actually of the animal itself, taking different organs across the fish or shellfish. And then it comes back to a laboratory where it's looked at by diagnosticians. And that's a really critical part. What we do is, we work collaboratively with those diagnosticians and epidemiologists when we're looking at these serious diseases.
Sorry, the jargon alarm's gone off there. What's an epidemiologist?
Basically, they look at disease in populations. So what they give is real information about how diseases are spreading between different animals. A good example would be when you go down to a trout farm, there's a dead fish in the corner of the farm. Not in itself very good for the fish, but does actually mean anything. But if you've got problems all over the farm, the epidemiologist will be able to look at those potential mortality events, as it were, and on other farms and try and make some connections. Are they associated with the spread of animals between different production premises and the like? And they help build up that picture of disease spread. So they're absolutely key for many things. They also help develop the Inspectorate. When they talk about taking samples, they actually say how many samples we need to take to have some confidence that there's a real issue happening, or, really importantly, whether we're free of a disease. If you just won't take one fish out of the tank and sample it for a particular disease and don't find it, it's quite hard to say on that basis that there is a disease in somewhere else. If you take, say, 30, 40 fish in a nice randomly distributed way, it can give you some real power to make that conclusion that we're free of the disease. So epidemiologists are very key to this type of work we do.
So what you're saying is the fish health inspectors take a piece of the jigsaw puzzle, you in the lab take a bit of the jigsaw puzzle, and they solve the jigsaw puzzle and give it back to you and say what you should do.
That's more or less it,
That's
yeah.
it,
Yeah.
So I wanted to move on a little bit to the research that you mentioned. So how can we innovate aspects of this to make sure that we can react quicker and stuff like that?
I'll talk about what we're doing in the lab, giving much better, more precise information. And a good example, probably everyone's aware from COVID, we talked about variants. Well, what's a variant? It's actually a very subtle difference between different causes species of the virus. And that's because we've got molecular techniques. We can sequence them and differentiate them. That technology is also applied in other elements of farming, including fish farming. Say particular virus isolates that we take from fish from different areas. We can look at the genetic sequence of that virus and say, yep, it looks almost identical to that one that we picked up 300 miles away. By the way, we can show that there was a fish movement, and we can use this technology to help the Inspectorate make proper inferences about how diseases are spreading, and also give us some real indication when there's a new emerging disease. Sometimes you have a new virus emerging. Sometimes a virus does a new trick. It changes, or a bacteria becomes different. It becomes more pathogenic. It finds a way of getting around your normal control strategies, and we can sequence them.
The jargon lab's gone off there. What's pathogenic?
It causes more serious disease.
Thank you. So thank you for that information about the lab and some of the testing that you're doing in terms of genetics. Is there anything on site, that technology maybe that's emerging that's helping with your on-site inspections?
Yes, so one of the big parts of our job is to go out and check records. Probably one of the more important ones is the movement records of fish and shellfish moving to and from sites. And the reason we do that, in the same way with COVID, like track and trace, we need to know where things have gone to, where they've come from in the event of a disease outbreak. And previously, what we were doing was going out to sites, would have had a disease outbreak, collected their paper records, had to work through those records and then go to these other sites, basically. It took a lot of time. So what we've done is developed an online system where farmers can actually record their movements online and in real time. So what it means is if there's a disease outbreak, we can very quickly check to see where things have come from and gone to, track and trace, and quickly place controls on potentially affected site. So it's a really beneficial tool that's helping now, and there's been quite a good uptake in industry, but that's one of the things we've changed slightly.
So just based on your answer there, I'm going to delve a little bit deeper into that answer because I find it really interesting. So this online portal of movements, how can you understand, and what time frame does it take you to understand those movements? Is it, a bit of analysis that goes on, or is it, we can tell that it's all around point A? Can you explain a little bit more how you use that tool if you were to have an outbreak, maybe use an example, how it would work and the time frame involved with that, because that's fascinating.
It really is a simple case of, I suppose, identifying where the source sites are for fish that have moved on to let's say we've got one affected trout farm. We're looking at who supplied that trout farm, but also where those fish have gone on to. So have they gone to another farm? So it's quite a relatively quick analysis. And again, there we'd be working with our epidemiologists in the lab to try and very quickly figure out what kind of areas we need to then be taking further samples from the affected farms. It's a fairly quick process, but what I would say is luckily we haven't had cause to use it yet. It's good to have that tool there because I think it's going to save us a lot of time and also be beneficial for industry and wildlife.
So one thing I wanted to go into in a bit more detail is it's really good to be prepared. And I wondered, is there more that we can talk about in terms of this prevention instead of cure? Are there ways that we can prevent these diseases from spreading instead of acting once they're already here? And I'm going to throw that to you, Dave.
Yes, I think biosecurity, and that's very important, but actually there are other tools that we use in animal production and indeed in human medicine. And one of the really good ways of protecting fish in particular, because they mount a good immune response, is vaccination. So we use a lot of salmon. There's a lot of salmon grown in the coast of Scotland and Norway. And people may not be aware, our trout and our salmon in particular are routinely immunised, protected against a wide variety of bacterial and viral diseases. So vaccination is something that we're looking to encourage. People are also aware that we're trying to reduce the amount of antibiotics that we use in fish farming, just as in all other areas.
How do you give a fish a vaccine?
That's a good question. The easy way, millions and millions and billions of bacterial cells. You can kill the bacterial cells, make a suspension, and basically you can make the fish swim around in it, which we call an immersion vaccine. And those some vaccines, that works quite well. And obviously that's really easy for the farmer. The other way is believe it or not, we inject them. Just the same as when you go along and you get your injected in the arm, we do the same thing to fish. We turn them on their upside down and we inject the vaccine into their belly. It provides really good protection.
Incredible that you can immerse them in the vaccine and then, that's incredible. I never thought of it that way. That's amazing. Thank you so much. Is there something that you're working towards research-wise at the minute or a wish list that you might have?
I think what would be really nice is the salmon industry is really good at vaccinating their fish. I think there's many other farming systems around the world that would like to use more vaccines, like catfish, or one of the problems we have is shrimp, very important. I mentioned them earlier. They don't really mount a good immune response, so we're looking for really good new treatments for them, more towards prevention. I think that's key.
So you've talked a little bit there about chemical treatments, and I've also heard that you can use biological treatments. So can you go into an example of how you can get rid of parasites using other species?
Oh, yes, the cleaner fish, as we call them. That's really quite popular now in the salmon industry. These fish called lumpfish or wrasse, put them into the cages with the salmon and they basically go along and they nibble the parasites, particularly sea lice, off the flanks of the fish.
So earlier you talked a little bit about antimicrobial resistance, and I really wanted to just touch on, obviously there's going to be bacteria and viruses and pathogens naturally in the environment. So how do fish protect themselves?
Just the same as us, they have natural defences. They have all sorts of complicated mechanisms in terms of their immunology, of fighting off pathogens. As you mentioned, they're continually exposed to them, just as we are. And mostly they don't get sick. One of the things actually is probably worth raising is this idea of this, what we call the pathobiome concept, where the idea is that the world is a collection of microorganisms and animals are interacting, sometimes in a positive way. I mean, we can think of probiotics and eating yogurt, and bugs can be good for us. And we want to try and maintain good gut health, making sure the animals are reared in appropriate conditions. I think a lot going on at the moment in human, animal, fish medicine is getting away from that concept of that single pathogen and that single host. It's the complex of microorganisms, the animals being reared, and indeed the environment. And we haven't got onto that about how temperature is such a critical part of disease processes in fish.
You talked a little bit there about making sure that they're in the right environment, that they have got the correct gut health. Have we already got a way of detecting that when we're doing our inspections, or is that something very much in the future if we can test what their gut health might be?
That is a difficult question. Although actually it's kind of simple in a sense as well, though, because we don't. Is the answer have that well, we don't apply that technology ourselves at the moment anyway.
Yeah, there's a lot of research at the moment in that space, both by us and others, looking at that whole idea. In fact, there's some scientists at CFAS that have really been pioneering their concept of the pathobiome and looking at that kind of more holistic way of looking at disease interactions. One of the main differences maybe between diseases and problems in aquaculture and fish, humans and pigs and poultry is the temperature. Obviously, we all regulate our body temperature. Everything's the same temperature. And diseases all affect warm-blooded animals. One of the most important differences is fish and shellfish are not able to regulate their body temperatures. They are at the mercy of the temperature of the water they're in. And that really has a massive impact on the type of diseases that affect them. And Chris will give you some examples in a minute, but other inspections will vary depending on the time of the year because they know the sort of diseases that the shellfish are going to be affected by are going to change depending on the temperature that they're being reared in. So that's, as well as water being moving diseases, maybe that's another important difference between the way that disease affects fish and shellfish, maybe as it does to, say, us and maybe our pet dog, cat, or even the chickens we're eating.
Do you collect temperature in your inspections? And have you got any examples where that prevalence has increased with temperature? And how is that going to change as the temperatures increase? Hopefully we've got that preparation in place that you were speaking about earlier, where we're already monitoring those temperatures and we can keep an eye on preventing the possible impacts of climate change. Can you go into a bit of detail?
It's very seasonal, our work. It's often dictated by temperature for the reasons Dave's just outlined.
Just as we're seeing animals in different parts of the world, we're also seeing spread and movement of diseases related to changes in temperature. So this is one thing that Chris and his colleagues and us are really concerned about is how are these diseases going to change that are affecting the animals that we're in our wild environments and we're farming. And this is a lot of unknowns there and a significant concern.
I think with regards to the impact of climate change, it clearly is a concern, as you say, David. It's a real worry, and particularly for the emerging diseases as well. There's that element. We don't know what's next on the horizon, the next serious disease that could emerge within industry. Yeah. It's a big concern, but it's something that we're obviously aware of, and we need to keep monitoring.
So we're getting to the end of our episode now, and one thing that I would like to feature is our fun fact. So normally this is a fact that we can take away as the listener from this podcast and tell our friends and family about it. I always say take it to a party as a conversational opener, because clearly all I talk about is the ocean and fish when I'm at a party, which I quite enjoy. So it's really what kind of interesting piece or nugget of information we can take away from this episode to tell our friends and family about this podcast and about this subject, because it's been a fascinating journey so far. So I'm going to go to Chris first, please.
Well, I think speaking about the variety in the industry that we see and that we inspect, I always find it amazing that there are over 500 aquatic animal species that are grown globally, both for food and for other reasons. So I think that's an amazing fact, really, to think about that different variation in species that are farmed around the world.
It's 500 different species. That's a huge number. It's blown my mind. Over to you.
A really interesting fact is bacteria can share genetic information with each other. They can take chunks of DNA and they can transfer it to other bacteria. And what's even neater about that, they don't even have to be the same species. They can share that DNA with bugs from completely different families, which is really extraordinary. And that has real practical implications. Often they carry resistance genes, so there's sort of practical implications for that ability for what we call gene transfer between bacteria.
So does that help us to be better prepared? If we've seen bits of genetic material before, we might be able to be better prepared if they're sharing it all over the place?
Very much so, and it happens all the time in clinical medicine. And the same in fish to some extent. But you can look and you can see that genetic signature, and you say, oh, that particular genetic signature is maybe confer resistance to a particular antibiotic that can then decide whether or not that bacteria can be treated that's causing the infection with a particular antibiotic. So there's real practical implications for this. Say in this case, probably veterinarians and doctors, but also to some extent in the aquaculture industry too.
So you've talked about some pretty big topics there, and I just have to ask, so is all bacteria bad? Should I worry?
No, you really shouldn't. In fact, we need them. You know, your gut is full of bacteria that keep you healthy, and it's really important that you keep them happy and properly fed. Most bacteria are completely benign. In fact, they're very important parts of what we term ecosystem services. They keep the planet functioning. They keep minerals and nutrients recycled. All sorts of really important things they do. And in fact, some of what we talk about, we talked earlier about the microbiome, is trying to make sure that the gut is healthy, and that means really having a good, stable community of bacteria. If your gut bacteria and all the bacteria associated with you are the right ones, you're less likely to get disease. So no, please don't think that all bacteria are bad.
So thank you so much for this session. It's been really fascinating topic to delve into. It's been absolutely fascinating to speak to both of you. So thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to bringing up some of those fun, interesting facts at my next party.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening. This podcast was made by CEFAS, the Centre for Environment, Fisheries and Aquaculture Science. To keep up to date with us, follow us on social media using @CEFASGovUK. We hope you can join us again next time.